Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Wine Australia Head of Market Export Update. My name is Ali Lockwood. I'm the Manager of Stakeholder Engagement for Wine Australia. I'm here today filling in for Linda Schenk, who's currently on holiday in Fiji. Lucky Linda. I'm delighted to be here today with you and very excited to be introducing our presenters today, who are Aaron Ridgway, who's the Head of Market for North America for Wine Australia, Willa Yang, who's the Head of Market for China for Wine Australia, Laura Jewell, MW, Head of Market for EMEA for Wine Australia, and Hiro Tajima, Senior Manager, Regional Development, Asia Pacific for Wine Australia. The Wine Australia team are currently in Australia for the Exporter Update to be held in Adelaide tomorrow. Today you'll have an opportunity to listen to their presentations, which will include an overview of Wine Australia's international strategies and major activities in global markets over the next 12 months, which exporters can directly participate in. During the webinar, we would love to hear from you. So if you want to make any comment at all or ask questions, you can use the question button at the bottom of your screen. And I'll be happy to pass through any comments or queries to our presenters during the presentations. As always, we will be recording this session and we will provide you with a link to rewatch this presentation at your leisure. So let's get started. Aaron, it's now over to you.
Thanks, Ali. And thanks everyone for joining on this Wednesday afternoon in Adelaide and wherever you may be. It is an exciting time. We've got the Exporter Forum starting tomorrow this year for the US, which is the big focus of our market in the Americas. It's particularly exciting. We have a number of US panelists coming in to join us for a bit of a session on the market and where perhaps things might be headed. So they're arriving today. So far we don't know of any flight delays or anything like that. Fingers crossed. But look, no doubt, as most of you or all of you would know, the Export and Regional Wine Support Package has indicated that there'll be some additional support for the US and for China, as well as some other Wine Australia activities over the next 3 years. So definitely the US has been designated as a big opportunity for growth for the Australian category, and we're excited by that. Just want to say from the outset that there will still be room for us to make some strategic investments into Canada. That's a really important market for Wine Australia, and we want to accept the fact that it's a defend market, but actually try to take some proactive steps to seeing if we can't help Canada to grow and maintain our market share there, which is significant. So I'm really going to talk a lot about the US in this presentation, but over the next 3 years, you will still see some strategic investment from Wine Australia into Canada. So just jumping right into the first slide. Use the mouse, apparently. There we go. Hopefully everybody can see that. So I've just organised this presentation according to the classic game of Texas Hold'em, which is you're trying to beat the house and you have the flop, the turn and the river. You can disregard that because it's really about the content of the presentation. But I was trying to think about, some of the themes and some of the dynamics that are relevant in the US. And it sort of started to occur to me that we still need luck. We still need quite a bit of adrenaline and perhaps the firm belief that if we sit there for long enough and really try to figure out the challenge, we might find ourselves at an advantage. But just in terms of a summary on a single page, I wanted to put together some of the key rules of engagement that are still really relevant for the US market. You can just see in the top left there that, and this is recent, so this is 2016 data through Nielsen. Still 75% domestic wine, 25% imports by volume. And then when you look at that by value, you can actually see that the import category sells for a few basis points more than the domestic category. So there are a couple of factors there. Imports included within that, you certainly get, naturally higher priced appellations like Bordeaux, Burgundy, Champagne, etc. But it is interesting because import growth is slightly outpacing domestic growth. So while if you look at the slide on the top right, the getting's really good if you're a California producer or a domestic producer. It is a nice sign of health that the import category is growing a little bit more quickly than domestic. Just still on that slide on the top left, about 50% of the wine market is still controlled by what we call the big three, so Gallo, Constellation and the Wine Group. Collectively, those three companies haven't invested all that heavily in Australia. There are investments in the Australian category within them, but it's still a challenge for Wine Australia and I think for individual producers to try to get those large companies to pay attention to Australia in some way. They still have enormous influence over the standard, comings and goings of the wine market, and we, have a few strategic approaches that we're considering to try to encourage, some of those larger companies to, if they're not dealing with Australia at all, at least be open to a conversation about whether there's a competitive advantage that can be exploited. Or I don't know if you saw recently, since 1961, we just had the shortest global production vintage in over 50 years. So could we be headed for a global shortage of grapes? If so, Australia has a lot of grapes, a couple of million tonnes per year. We have a lot of material that we can make and sell for a really good price. So perhaps we could be looking at a future competitive advantage. Don't want to spend too long on that slide on the top right, but you'll see there that the fortunes are pretty mixed. Italy, New Zealand, France, Spain are experiencing some growth, and all the way over on the right, Argentina and Australia, which don't have dissimilar challenges as countries in terms of being quite significantly anchored to a particular variety, and perhaps facing some headwinds, but in the case of Australia, which I'll get to shortly, showing some really positive turnaround. The bottom two illustrations there are just a bit of a checkup on how the distribution and the three-tier system rules of the game are kind of playing out. If you just look at distributor market share, it's still, things are still very much driven by the four big distributors, Southern Glaciers, which is more than twice the size of its nearest competitor. RNDC, Breakthrough and Young's Market making up the rest of that 60% share. Hearing a little bit of a rumour that Breakthrough and RNDC might be having some discussions around merging. Heard that for some time, but apparently those discussions are generating noise, and perhaps there have been some, exchange of contracts and so forth around that. Not expecting anything until January 1st, but just so you know, it could be on the horizon. And then just that list of top 10 wine distributors there, again, is just a reminder that, even though it's 335 million people, it's a $62 billion wine market, the actual cluster of decision makers at the distribution level is still fairly small and fairly concentrated, and perhaps anticipated to concentrate further. So, we're just trying to understand that we don't have a ton of influence as Wine Australia in that space. We would love to, but we certainly talk to those companies, one-on-one, and try to understand what their internal priorities are and how we can provide support either through education or, encouraging inbound trips to Australia for, further category engagement. So we've seen the flop, and now we are on the turn. So the turn is figurative and literal. 2017 has been a really big year for the Australian category in the US. We've seen further consolidation of positive sentiment in the media. We've actually seen the MAT numbers, while we're still shedding some value, we're still increasing although we're shedding volume, we're still increasing in value. And the MAT numbers through last month pointed to a 3% increase for that 12 months, and an 11% increase in the segment of wines that sell for over $15 a bottle retail in the US. So that's great to see double-digit growth in really the target segment for many of Wine Australia's key messages and strategic programs is really good. It's really promising. We launched a new kind of headline campaign in the US in 2017 called Australia Up Close. It took some of the elements of SAVOR, which was our former kind of large-scale, education and event campaign, and sort of moved it in a slightly different direction. We hit 5 cities in the US and a number of cities in Canada, and we got 1,000 traded media across that campaign, which we felt was a really strong result. We got some good media hits. We're still learning about sales ROI that's coming from, some buyers that attended those events, and whether they did it immediately or took a heck of a long time to get around to making some adjustments in their sets. we received some really positive feedback, and we're going to look at making Australia Up Close a bit of an annual element in our programming in some way. Doing that number of cities allowed us to have different seminars in each of those cities and test and review a number of new subjects that we could put into our seminars, whether it be old vines or a particular variety or regional focus. And again, we got some really good feedback about the education messages in those. And just the quality of our influencers. Our seminar panels were comprised of some local influencers and some winemakers, and we got some really good discussion between, some real leaders in the trade and the winemakers that joined us for that. So that was terrific. More recently in September, we held our Artisans of Australian Wine events in San Francisco and New York, building on the fantastic work that Laura's team in London did last year. So again, we wanted to adapt the elements of the Artisans campaign from London that we felt would really work in the US. It was a smaller group of winemakers and a smaller group of attendees, but we think, again, we were able to break through and develop a bit of a presence for artisans over there. We had 160 across the two cities. So again, smaller events, very, very targeted. You'll see the photo on the right there is from Max Fish, which is a dive bar in New York City. Perfect venue for the artisans, grungy, a little bit disruptive, but we had Alice Firing, Joe Chawinski, Josh Reynolds, Christina Picard, the New Australia critic for wine enthusiasts. So I think when that group came through, we managed to get, again, some great people in front of them and hearing their stories. We will probably alternate the years in which we do artisans going forward, so that the UK can have an artisans activation in the even year, and then we can have ours in the odd year. So that was really exciting. And also as part of that week, so that ended up being kind of under the umbrella of what became known colloquially and then formally as Aussie Wine Week. So we took the artisans from San Francisco across to New York, and we actually put together a number of supplementary activities to happen in that same time frame in New York in that second week of September. One of those events was called Taste of Australia. It was a little bit different from what we usually do in that it was a targeted consumer and lifestyle media, kind of pour and taste event in Williamsburg in Brooklyn. We partnered with 5 Australian chefs in New York City and got 30 wine brands involved through distributors to basically put on, just a big and exciting outdoor party. We got some great media coverage, as you can see from the Twitter impressions there. It again was trying to extend our social reach, trying to try a few things in the digital space and see if we can have some impact, which we feel as though we did. We worked with a couple of third-party companies actually. We retained a PR agency to help us drive awareness of the event and manage some results in social media, and we also used an event and production company there with a bunch of Aussies as well to again reinforce those messages. So again, as we see the impact of the grant money, we might be able to do some activations in this space that help us, tell that story more loudly and perhaps in different parts of the country. Just keeping on time. Also in that week, we conducted the Shiraz Terroir project. So that was a partnership with the AWRI. We had 2 visiting, one PhD and his candidate, Wes Pearson and John Blackman. You can see them there on the right-hand side. And that was an incredibly high-level tasting of Shiraz, blind, with some international wines in there, which were then unveiled one at a time. And we had some great discussion about technical winemaking, regionality, and that was sort of a way to frame the 6-year multi-million-dollar research grant given by Wine Australia to understand the regional differences and terroir-driven differences of Shiraz. So again, a slightly different activation, a little bit disruptive, but really exciting. Final part of that was in San Francisco. That was BevCon. It's a third-party trade conference in San Fran. 100 top trade across 3 days. Australia was featured in a number of the seminars and at the big walk-around tasting on the Thursday. Great numbers of that. And you'll see some more details about BevCon because we've just signed on as a sponsor in 2018 as well. And just finally, our final card, The River. So this is really just a snapshot of our activities in 2018. You can see it's pretty busy. We've got our winter trade tastings coming back in San Francisco and Toronto again in February. We are putting together a really big and splashy presence in Vinexpo in New York in March. EOIs have closed for that. We've got all of our expressions of interest, and we're working on our pavilion design and content for our masterclasses and so forth. We are workshopping an Australia camp. So, a gathering of US influencers somewhere in America, overcome some of the challenges of trying to get people to Australia. And as I mentioned, BevCon, Australia Up Close and Aussie Wine Week, all coming back. So just in closing, big year. We saw some great stuff happen in 2017, and we've got plenty more to look forward to next year. I believe I'm out of time.
Thanks, Aaron, and that's certainly really exciting to hear about what's happening in the US market. And I think certainly with the Export Regional Wine Support Package, there'll be a lot more activity happening in the next 2.5 years. So exciting times ahead for the US and also for China. So I would like to now welcome Willie Yang, who is our Head of Market in China, who will also be covering off on some exciting activity happening in the next 12 months as well. Thank you, Willa.
Thank you, Ali. Good afternoon, everyone. My pleasure to join the webinar today. Just to share with you a little bit about the latest China update. If we look at mainly China in particular, it's a wine market worth of 48 billion US dollars as of 2016. I remember the figure for 2015, which is 23 billion. So it's almost doubled in 1 year. So it's really impressive. Whereas for volume, for 2016, it's a 2.2 billion liters wine market compared to 2015, which is 2.1 billion. So it's not a big increase, but quite steady growth in volume. In China, in terms of price point for reds, any wine actually in retail over 90 RMB plus, which is roughly 18 Australian dollar plus retail, enjoys the biggest growth. And the two major red variety, which has enjoyed some of the bigger growth are Merlot and Cabernet Franc. However, the red variety of Cabernet Sauvignon remains as the strongest red variety, whereas Chardonnay in China market is the biggest white variety. Let's see how we are doing in the market in terms of Australia. So since September 2016, last year, mainly China has already become Australia's biggest export market by value. And we have enjoyed 56% up in value and 46% up in volume. And in terms of average value per liter, we also enjoy 7% up. And in terms of the total export value, mainly China actually accounts for 30% of the share, so which is quite impressive. If we look at the chart on the left-hand side, so for China markets, for the total Chinese wine, domestic wine, it accounts for 70%, a bit over 70% of the market share, whereas all the imported wine accounts for 29%. These are all in terms of volume. So for us, Australia, if we look at the total wine China market, we account for 5% of the market share in terms of volume. But if we look at how we are doing in all the imported wine in China, we actually enjoyed higher percentage. So in terms of value, actually Australian wine accounted for over 25% market share in terms of value in all the imported wine. So it's very impressive. It's almost like 1/4 of the imported wine market in China. And we also enjoy the highest average value per liter among the top 5 exporters to China, which means our average value actually is higher than the French. In terms of the growth trend, if we look at the price points for different varieties, Shiraz FOB over Australian dollar 10 and above actually enjoys a lot of growth and one of the highest growth. So does the Cabernet Sauvignon and its blends over $10 plus. The Shiraz and its blend, Cabernet and its blends still are the major two red varieties, to China. Okay, so just a little bit on the mainland China itself. As you know, China is a big country with a lot of population. However, the per capita wine consumption is still very low, like 0.8 liter, which is only 1/4 of the world's average. So there's a lot of room to grow if we all do our things right in this market. So in general, the consumer has very limited wine knowledge in China. So education is key. So not just Australia, I think every wine producing country or regions, they have spent more and more resources on education to both trade, media, and consumers. And in China, the online sales are booming. I think we talked about this topic in last year's Exporter Update conference, just on e-commerce itself. So it shows the importance of e-commerce and also the growth in e-commerce, especially in China and especially in the wine sector. So the biggest player is Tmall.com, JD.com, who also reported very much growth also in the wine sector. Interesting to talk about is also O2O concept, which is online to offline. So that means a lot of big online retailers, they now have either opened offline stores or cooperate with a lot of chain retail stores offline. So they try to promote themselves, not just online, and also try to use the offline stores to attract more consumers to their store, experience the product, service, and then put them back to online in order for more sales revenue. So this is quite interesting phenomena. And like for Tmall, they have Hema, delivery in all the key cities in Shanghai. That Hema concept actually offline enable Tmall to deliver, for example, wines just within 30 minutes to an hour if you are in these key cities. So it's a quite convenient way of selling products in China, and this is only available to most of the big retailers who can afford to do that. The retail distribution is still very important, although because the impact of the e-commerce online, the offline retailer actually the retail sales actually shrink, but it is still very important. Because for consumers, it's easy to see the offline stores, and they still buy stuff by offline retailers. So it's still very important. However, for on-trades in China, because of the margins in hotels, restaurants are very, very high. I should say ridiculously high. The margins too much. So the volume by on-trade for wine is much smaller than volume. The value is quite high, but the volume is still very low. But people always see, if my wine is on the wine list through hotels, restaurants, it's always good. It's more for branding. But it's getting more and more importance in the past 1 or 2 years. Social media is still strong. I think a lot of, when we see a lot of Australian friends coming to China, I noticed every year more and more Aussie got their WeChat account, so which is a really interesting and encouraging sign. So because in China, a lot of people using WeChat as a social media tool. So if you really want to reach someone, you do not call them anymore. You just use WeChat. So we have 864 million WeChat users. And also for Weibo, which is a more like Twitter-like, which is 340 million users. So people use WeChat and social media to communicate. They also use this tool to sell and also do marketing, do branding. So it becomes a very important channel for marketing, for sales, for branding. And as you know, China loves red wine, so it still dominates the market. But according to the figures, now the red wine is maybe 80% of the market, whereas like 5 years ago, it's like 95%. So it's a good sign that Chinese consumer, when they getting to know more about wine, like white wine consumption, also rosé, sparkling, they're also getting more and more popularity, especially among young people. So the importance of middle-class consumers in China, is actually something interesting to see. And if you look at the growing number of the mid-class consumer is now reached over 200 million, whereas I think 2 years ago, it's 100 million. So this also helps with a lot of consumption, including wine. And we talk a lot about the younger generation. And these are the type of customer actually we are all targeting, who will, if you can imagine, in the next 5 years, 10 years, they are the group of people who will drink wine, who will drink Australian wine.
Well, I'll interrupt there. We've had a couple of questions come through from our audience, so thank you very much for sending those through. We only have 5 minutes to go, so I think after this, if we can look at what's happening in the next 12 months as well. The questions from our audience is Merlot growth. What price segment is growing? And is Australia driving that growth or another country? That's question one. And I'll quickly slip in the second question. Thank you, Angela. Small to medium-sized wineries, what's the best way for a small to medium-sized Australian winery to manage their WeChat chat account? And I think this is a very relevant question for a number of producers.
So the first question on Merlot, I think definitely not Australia driving the growth, because Bordeaux, actually, they are leading the growth. But I think according to our Australian export report, Merlot also has been one of the top 3 growing variety to China. So this is also something, we can look at. Just quickly on the WeChat, it's just a ongoing topic. Everyone asks about how we, manage our social media accounts. Even for Wine Australia, we have our own official social media account. But how to run it efficiently and compete with so millions of accounts online, this is really a question. But the best way is not just to open a social media account, get some Chinese staff to write it. That's not enough. You need to have a social media WeChat strategy. You need to involve some local agency who can help you to, reach a broader audience. Just if you guys are interested in more on the social media WeChat topic, just feel free to talk to us and see how we can help you. Okay, so just quickly, the highlights. So during the past 10 months, what we are doing in the China market, because as I said before, education is very important. So we have been organizing different mass classes during the past several years. But one interesting topic we have done in early of the year is the aged Australian wine mass classes. So because for Chinese consumers, if the wines can age well, they are good wines. So this is the first time for us actually to organize a topic relating to aged Australian wine. So we will keep doing this kind of interesting topic, which will lift the premier image of Australian wine in the market. So we also have been focusing on a lot of key trade shows in China, like the Chengdu Fair, which is the biggest food and wine show in China in every March. And we have been managed to had a Wine Australia Pavilion through that trade show, which attracts 100,000 visitors. So it's quite impressive. And the China Roadshow is always popular. We go to second-tier cities and first-tier cities to not just to showcase Australian wine in a more uniform format, but also to have potential opportunities, sales opportunities via those markets. And the China Awards, we just finished recently last month, which is a way to actually award our partners, Chinese partners in the market. So this is a very nice photo of all the best winners of importers, retailers, F&B and educators who actually have been promoting Australian wine in the market, and we recognize by this kind of program. Just quickly upcoming, so we have Provine, actually next week, we have 22 exhibitors join us, and we will again have Chengdu Fair and also the Roadshow next year. I think Chengdu Fair is already full, I'm sorry, but for the Roadshow, there's a lot, still some space to fill in. And also Vinexpo Asia is also very important a very important event in Hong Kong. So if you guys are all interested in this Australia website and this event, and you can either register with us or send us email.
There is one final question which has come through, which is what percentage of wines sold to China are Australian-owned brands? If you could provide a short response on that, that would be much appreciated. Thank you.
Australian-owned brands to China.
Yes. What percent?
So are we talking about the market share or number of brands, or all the Australian brands, or
perhaps Australian-owned versus customer-owned label? Perhaps if the
I think still most of the brands going to China are Indian brands. So majority of them still Winer brands, and these are the brands that we are promoting a lot.
Okay, all right. We're going to have to wrap it up there. Thank you very much, Willa. Again, exciting times ahead for China. I will hand you over now to Laura Jewell, NW, Head of Market EMEA. And before I do that, if I can just let you know, we have received a question on the US. Unfortunately, Aaron Ridgway has had to leave the room, but I will pass that question on to him. Over to you, Laura.
Good afternoon, everybody. My market snapshot looks a little different, mainly because I didn't want to put lots of numbers up there. But I'm going to start with the UK and that big B word in the middle. A year ago, I talked about signs and implications and a certain amount of optimism regarding Australia's position. 1 year later, I have attended so many conferences and discussions, met with the Wine and Spirit Trade Association, and I can stand before you and say, or sit before you and say, there is still uncertainty. Yes. Yes, we have moved on with triggering Article 50. We've had a general election which undermined the Conservatives, but it is now strongly felt that the parties involved are just not getting on with it. The EU is not interested. It has had other elections in France and Germany to deal with, never mind the increased terrorism threat, which is a real issue. Currency has improved slightly, but we're still sitting at 169, 170 for the Australian dollar, UK pound. Negotiations to increase prices have happened generally with the major retailers, and the average price point of wine has gone up in the UK. And are about to get another one in 2 weeks' time in the autumn budget. The UK now has the second highest excise duty rate in Europe after Ireland. Am I still optimistic about Australia's position? Yes. We are seeing strong trading up, with the value of bottled imports overtaking that of bulk for the first time since 2012. The decline in sales has bottomed out, with the off-trade Australia growing in the second quarter to the end of June. And there have been numerous meetings and discussions with the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, the WSTA, Wine Australia, and various others on the potential advantages to the regulatory side. Putting the UK and Brexit aside, other key markets for us in Europe include Germany, the monopoly markets in the north, Benelux, and Denmark. In Germany, the market is still dominated by the discounters, with Aldi and Lidl alone having 38% share of the off-trade and all driving own label. The economy, however, is robust. With Merkel having survived the election, there are clear signs of premiumisation, with volume in slight decline but value up. Over in Belgium and the Netherlands, the overall markets are down. And while pricing is increasing due to excise duty, there still remains a large amount of cross-border trading, which is impossible to track. In Belgium, the on-trade has suffered due to loss of tourism following the Brussels attacks, and 90% of wine in total is sub €5 per bottle. However, the picture is brighter in the Netherlands, where the on-trade increase reflects a better economy and wine is seen as a healthy option, and the average price has increased. We're just back from 2 weeks in the Nordics, where we held meetings with each of the monopoly buyers. Many of the trends we're seeing are consistent across the markets, including healthy living, sourcing locally, and the good life centred around cooking and premium wine. In Sweden, the monopoly has achieved its target for organically certified wines and now has 12.4% of the total range certified organic. Interestingly, 7% of the Australian range is organic, a lot more than I would have thought. However, 36% of Spanish wine and 70% of Argentinian wine is organic. And in Finland, there is a big Shiraz promotion planned for next year, and the on-trade and online markets in Denmark are particularly buoyant. In each of these markets, bag-in-box is still significant, with over 55% market share in Norway, for instance, although the growth has levelled out. Other key markets doing well are the United Emirates, Arab Emirates, Ireland, despite its high duty rates, Poland from a small base, and Russia. Overall, trends are around premiumisation, health. Our recent masterclasses on sustainable in the Nordics were full with a waiting list. Rosé, sparkling, bag-in-box in the Scandinavian markets, and responsibility. There is also an ongoing requirement for wine education through the WSET and the Institute of Masters of Wine. So what has gone well? Well, it's been a year full of activity and significantly upgrading the activities we do each year. In January, we held the largest Australia Day tasting yet in London. It is now a must-do event in the trade calendar. We moved to a new venue, allowing us the capacity to welcome 1,200 plus guests, host 3 masterclasses for 60 people each, and highlight focus tables. With over 80 tables of exhibitors and over 1,000 wines on show, it was incredibly busy. In March, we returned to Düsseldorf Provine, with over 75 wineries on our stand and a full programme of tutored and feature tastings. And as you know, Provine is all about meetings and doing business. And the highlight for this year was the on-stand barista. And he didn't look too bad either, making non-stop coffee. Business-wise, there were lots of reports from wineries of negotiations and meetings doing well. We know that the Australia Day tastings in January are not well timed to get your winemakers over to attend. So for the past 3 years, we have also created events in September. This year, we teamed up with the Australian Women in Wine Awards to host their awards ceremony for the first time out of Australia. By combining this with a trade tasting, seminar, consumer tasting, we enticed over 60 women winemakers and owner-operators over to show their wines. 25 of the wineries were new to the UK, seeking distribution. And while we had some of the iconic names such as Prue Henschke and Sue Hodder, we also attracted a lot of the smaller women pioneers. The awards were live streamed to Australia in time for early evening celebration parties around the country here, and 6 of the 8 winners made it over to London. The energy in the room was fabulous and a great success. And we've heard anecdotally of at least 4 wineries who have found distribution as a result. I could tell you about so many successes in the last year, including our alternative varieties tasting, our inspired tasting just last week, but I'll stick to the big events. I've already mentioned our Nordic Roadshow. We did 4 countries, 4 cities in 2 weeks, and we included a market briefing, a trade tasting, and a consumer tasting in each. This year, Mark Davidson presented masterclasses on sustainable Australia, which were very popular. The markets were more enthused and lively than they were a year ago. And whilst the numbers varied from city to city, overall, we were really pleased with the quality and interest of both trade and consumer. So what next? Well, looking ahead, we have our Australia Day tastings in London, Edinburgh, and Ireland in January. We will be doing a State of the Nation briefing to journalists. Andreas Clark is coming over to present that. We have invited the AWRI to present a masterclass as part of a series of our masterclasses, and they will be doing further classes with the WSET and the Institute of Masters of Wine students. We're extending the masterclasses at the ADTs to reach more people, and we're working much more effectively with the venue to ensure a good flow through of people. As you can see from the picture, it was pretty busy. In Provine in March in 2018, we are full. We have had a waiting list for some time, and so I would encourage you to look ahead to 2019 if you haven't been successful to attend in 2018. We have been given 50 square metres extra space, so we have managed to fit a few more people in, and we will have a feature tasting area, so lots of mini tastings with themes. It will be a lot more educational. And our sneaky preview tasting the night before the fair was a huge success last year. And that came out of an idea from one of the audience at tomorrow's forum last year at that event. And we invited key importers and buyers from all over the world, from all markets who are at Provine. On the education side, we are hosting masterclasses and tastings in Belgium, Netherlands, and Germany with a format that works really well. And we're planning our next September event to entice some of you over, so watch this space. We'll be back in the Nordics, building on the key trends and messages there, particularly organic and sustainable. And we're sponsoring the final lunch at the Institute of Masters of Wine Symposium in Spain in June. And we've got lots of ideas of how to spend any additional funds that might come this way. Please don't forget UK and the EU as a market. It is still incredibly important. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. Apologies to our audience. Our visual has been turned off. Some of you will not be able to see us at all because we have had some technical issues. So apologies in advance for that. I will hand you over now, last but certainly by no means least, to Hiro Tajima, who is our Senior Manager, Regional Development for Asia Pacific. Over to you, Hiro.
Thanks, Ali, and good afternoon, everybody. So I love being the lucky last, and I get to talk about the Greater Asia, which for the sake of today's discussion means the wider Asia, excluding mainland China, Hong Kong, Macau, and Taiwan. This is in response to us now viewing Hong Kong, Macau, and Taiwan categorically as part of the Greater China, given they're closely related to mainland China. In turn, though, we have an opportunity to look at an exciting niche in Asia, which as a whole continues to evolve dynamically as nations, as well as wine markets. So firstly, let's look at the scale of this target region. Asia, other than China, Hong Kong, Taiwan, amounts to 37% of the total imported wine segment in the top 15 Asian markets. They are growing at 3.5% per annum on average. For Australian wine, in comparison, the rest of Asia equates only to 20% of our total export to all of Asia, suggesting a very strong propensity to China as a dominant destination. However, we are growing in export to this region at 5.3% per annum, which is better than the global average. The key message in my brief presentation today is that Asia means different, depending on which particular market one chooses to look at. Therefore, there are different things to be aware of and a need to respond differently according to your target market. I would roughly classify them into three categories: mature Asia, emerging Asia, and embryonic Asia. We will take a look at Japan as an example of the former, Malaysia as an example of the second, and Sri Lanka as an example of the latter category. So we look at Japan as a mature Asian wine market. Here's a bit of history lesson, but in March 1969, what is now the Japan Sommelier Association held its first wine seminar in Japan. The JSA now has more than 12,000 certified sommeliers in its membership and is the world's second largest sommelier association after Italy. The history of the Japanese wine market is basically synonymous to the JSA history, which has largely been characterized by all things French. The Japanese wine professionals have always taken wine very seriously, pursued very orthodox wine education and training as they aspired to the long-standing, most authentic wine culture, which in their mind was always French. In light of such a mindset, Australian wine has long struggled in this market. My argument, however, is that it is still too early to give up because of the critical changes that are currently occurring. The most exciting of these changes, along with the rapid rise in inbound tourism leading to the 2020 Tokyo Olympics, is the rise of the next generation sommeliers and wine professionals. They look more to the international and cosmopolitan wine scene, much beyond just France. They are open-minded and free from prejudice. Consequently, the tone and expectation for Australian wine in Japan has become one of much greater excitement, which should excite us. It is often forgotten that Japan is still the third largest economy in the world and has 5 times the Australian population. It is a very advanced and highly discerning consumer society. Therefore, their expectation is very high, both in terms of quality and price. So the product and marketing proposition needs to be highly polished in order to be taken seriously. Next, we look at Malaysia as an example of what I would call emerging Asia. In this market, the position of Australian wine is already high, with 47% at a number one position, thanks to the success of the key Australian wine brands. The current statistics show a decline in the value of Australian wine export, but this is after a period of very strong growth. To me, Malaysia has both an adequate market structure, which makes our category efforts worthwhile, and dynamic evolution as a consumer market. For example, there are some clear evidences that Kuala Lumpur is becoming a foodie city, beginning to rank alongside Singapore and Bangkok. The Malaysian foodies are also looking for something new and different, hipster or otherwise. It is quite understandable that Malaysian wine importers are said to be keen to discover new and unfamiliar brands of Australian wine, hence a fitting opportunity to present new Australian wine that meets their expectations. Thirdly, we look at Sri Lanka as an example of what I classify as embryonic. In comparison, the current size of the Sri Lankan imported wine market is 1/500th of China's and 1/235th of Japan's. So it's very, very small at this point. Sri Lanka as a wine market is yet to be even classified by the Wine Intelligence for its market classification. So it is literally embryonic in my mind, and in other words, it's still early days. The reason for my choice for discussion today, however, is because Sri Lanka is an increasingly popular destination for international travelers. In 2013, Lonely Planet nominated Sri Lanka as a #1 destination in the world to visit. In 2015, Forbes magazine ranked the island amongst the top 10 coolest countries to visit. Other global influencers, including Condé Nast Traveler, The Guardian, and the New York Times, also identified Sri Lanka as a top location to visit in 2016. Sri Lanka tourism has a bold plan to double the number of tourists from 2.2 million in 2016 to 4 million tourists by 2020. To service the rapidly growing tourism sector, the number of resorts is looking to increase from current 800 resort and luxury hotels providing 18,000 star classified hotel rooms. Given such a growth prospect, it will be a worthwhile exercise to look closely at how the wine section and procurement works, as well as the regulatory environment in wine import into Sri Lanka.
Hiro, before you move on to the next slide, I'll just interrupt your presentation with a question that I think is relevant for everyone in this audience. How many serious distributors for Australian wine are there in Sri Lanka at present?
Well, the reason why the market's still embryonic is because it hasn't quite taken shape yet. And the procurement is mainly driven by the Westerners, so it's more to do with who you know, sort of amongst the expats rather than locals. And the distribution sort of follows because it's still a very much resort-driven market. I will touch on later as part of what's coming up. And what is in the pipeline currently is a multi-market, emerging market roadshow, which does include Sri Lanka as a potential target. And we'll be taking advantage of those opportunities to sort of deepen our understanding of how the market works. So we'll be making that type of endeavor together with the industry.
Okay, thank you.
All right, we'll continue on. I'll use this page just to touch on some of the things that I think are key to success in this part of the world. So sorry about the fine print, but the first thing is that I think it's very, very important to know the regulations of these target markets. My observation is that some of these markets, not necessarily the very three markets that I'm discussing at this point, but generally it's particularly in Southeast Asia, where perhaps religion comes to play, and there are some sort of surprises in terms of the wine and alcohol products are regulated. my recommendation is that each one of you use our valued resources, which is the export market guides, which very much details all these areas. And because it's so detailed, sometimes it's difficult to understand what are the key points. And then my suggestion is, if you're so inclined, you would be welcome to call our office and speak to our regulatory services team in Adelaide. Then they should be able to take you through. The examples of these regulations that we should be aware of, for example, is the pre-arrival or pre-implementation product registration process, and there are some unusual prohibited substances that we need to know. Also, some countries have a register of prices of wine, where let's say you ship a product sample ahead of the formal import. But the customs will probably take a record of that price, and then later on they will be referring back to the price at which you claim, which may make it difficult for you to increase the price later on. So you need to have that picture, and some of which can be a bit complicated. So you need to be equipped with the right knowledge. Second point that I'm making here is that it is important for you to know the target markets and competitions. I provided some examples. For example, Tokyo versus other parts of Japanese cities, the way wine is consumed is somewhat different. In Tokyo, the consumption per capita is nearly 9 liters per person. But if you go to other regional cities within the same country, it decreases dramatically. If you go to another country like Southeast Asian countries, you need to know who are the right target. Is it the expat tourists or wealthy locals of the Chinese descent who may or may not worry so much about the religious constraints surrounding alcohol? So these are real in-market insights, which you can only understand by market visitations or at least by talking to people in the market who specialize in wine and liquor. And the third point is knowing the culture, and I'm a really big believer when it comes to selling and marketing Australian wine into the Asian destinations, including China, because it's just vastly different. We may think that wine will continue to grow as it has in the Western markets. But basically, the psychology is different, the culture is different, the environment is different. There are different styles of communication. Obviously, there are language barriers, and also the approach to time in terms of how much they would take to make a decision, or they keep coming back to sort of pre-decision making, and they will sort of make collective decisions and keep going back. These things takes incredible patience, and there will be some frustrations, but you need to be thick-skinned enough to cope with these in order for you to get success. So yeah, practice does make perfect. If taking Asian culture courses do help, then go ahead and take Asia Link business courses or other resources. Quickly, highlights. So this past year, we really focused on creating excitement about what's currently happening with Australian wine, and also to deepening our in-market stakeholders' knowledge about it. So we started this year with a history, evolution, revolution message in Singapore and Kuala Lumpur, as well as Hong Kong. And in May, we conducted this massively successful masterclass with Japan's first master of wine, Kenichi Ohashi. And we had a full house of more than 100 people, each of who paid money to get into this trade masterclass, which was really exciting. We had the biggest Australian annual wine grand tastings in Tokyo and Seoul, with more than 850 people in attendance in Tokyo. And more than 400 people attending in Seoul. And we had a number of peripheral activities, including Inspire Tasting in Tokyo, and we invited AWRI to Tokyo and Seoul, and we also invited Mike Benny, and he did a fantastic masterclasses alongside with Ken Ohashi in Tokyo. So it was really exciting. And later this month, we have a group of Asian leading lifestyle media representatives and writers visiting Australia from South Korea, Singapore, Japan, and Hong Kong. So what's to come this coming year? I particularly want to highlight two activities. One is a new to market Australian wine showcases in Kuala Lumpur and Taipei, which we have proposed to the industry, and looks like we can do this at the beginning of February next year, soon after the Australia Day tasting in the UK. So these are a 2-day in-market program designed to help you understand the market realities and to find prospective importers. We have until 15th of November for expressions of interest. So please visit the Wine Australia Asia Pacific website for the details. And later in the fiscal year, around June in 2018, we will also be taking a similar approach to executing an Asian emerging market roadshow, which targets Thailand, the Philippines, Vietnam, and Sri Lanka. So we are finalizing the proposal as a user pay activity, and we'll be putting that proposal onto our website shortly. So please watch this space. And the grand tastings in Tokyo and Seoul will continue in September 2018. And I'm in discussion with Australia, both Singapore and Japan, for a Taste of Australia collaboration and collaboration through collaborative promotion with Austrade and Meat and Livestock Australia. And we are also working on a concept to bring Japanese wine buyers to Australia so that they can be introduced to new brands. So that's it for me. If you want to look more closely into this part of Asia, then please feel free to get in touch with me. I'm based in Sydney, so I'm just one phone call or email away. Thanks.
Thank you, Hiro, for that great presentation. Look, we've actually got a few more minutes to spare, so if anybody would like to send questions through, we'd certainly encourage you to do so. We've got Hiro in the room, Laura and Willa. So one question has already come through for Willa. What do you think about the OEM market in China, and is it a potential one? Over to you, Willa.
This is a very interesting question because I think it's very China specific for OEM brands. I think mostly because of the Chinese are not really familiar with wine. So there's a lot of migrants coming to Australia who bring back their own brand. We call it OEM brands. So of course, there's always a market for that because these OEM brands actually are mostly sold through their own friends network, corporate purchase, not really through those traditional channels. So it's really for either could be immigration quota or someone's own network. So I think in the short term, within the next 5 years, I think they will still exist. But I think when the markets have more knowledge on wine and people, search online, they want to have see the story behind. Then, I mean, for OEM brands, it may meet a challenge on that. So, but definitely at the moment, I mean, there's a lot of OEM brands also going to China for sure.
Willa, do you have a gauge or a view on what percentage of total Australian imports are OEM brands in China?
Sorry, I don't have this data with me now. I'm not sure whether we have this kind of data, but we can look into that. Because the thing is, in our export data, it's all company's name, exporter's name, and we can recognize most of the wineries' name. But maybe for some, we do not recognize. So it's sometimes hard to identify who are having or exporting those OEM brands. So it's not very a straightforward data that we can share. But I think, like I said earlier, majority of the wine export to China are winery brands, for sure.
All right, well, thank you, Willa. I think that wraps up our presentation today. Thank you to all of our panel members for their insightful presentations. Our market managers will be in Adelaide for the exporter update tomorrow. So if some of you are attending, I'm sure they'd love to see you there. Thank you to everybody who also participated in today's webinar. This is actually Wine Communicator's last webinar for the year. So we hope that you've enjoyed the webinar series during 2017. We look forward to seeing you back in 2018. keep an eye on the Wine Communicators updates, which will provide more details on the webinar program for 2018. So that's it from us. Thank you, and we'll see you later.